The wind cut sharply across the channel, carrying with it the metallic scent of seawater and something far heavier fear. It was late May, 1940, and Europe was in chaos. The German army had stormed through Belgium and France with terrifying speed, a relentless force that seemed unstoppable. Soldiers retreated, cities fell, and a shadow of despair stretched across the continent. Among the panic and confusion, one place became the stage for an extraordinary act of courage: the beaches of Dunkirk. Imagine standing there, on the sands, looking out at the endless grey of the English Channel. Thousands of soldiers, British, French, and Belgian, were trapped between the advancing enemy and the water, with nowhere to turn. The German army had pushed them into a desperate corner. The beaches were crowded with the wounded, the exhausted, the frightened. And yet, in the distance, tiny specks appeared on the water, moving slowly, steadily, against the tide of hopelessness. These were not battleships. They were not even military vessels. They were ordinary boats, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, ferries piloted by men and women who had heard the call of duty. The little ships of Dunkirk were on their way. To understand the miracle that was about to unfold, you need to know how impossible the situation really was. The German blitzkrieg had created a stranglehold, a perfect trap. The Allied forces were pinned against the coast, with their backs to the water, their supply lines cut off, their options dwindling by the hour. The British Expeditionary Force, numbering over 300,000 men, faced annihilation. Large naval ships tried to reach the shore, but the shallow waters and constant air attacks from the Luftwaffe made close rescue almost suicidal. And yet, every moment wasted meant more lives lost. Meanwhile, back in England, a message spread like wildfire. We must save them. Civilians, fishermen, yacht owners, anyone with a seaworthy vessel were called to cross the channel. It was a call to arms, but without guns. It was a call to courage, but without strategy. They were ordinary people, ordinary men and women, about to perform something extraordinary. Families left their homes, men and women volunteered despite knowing the danger. For some, it was a sense of duty. For others, it was simply the knowledge that someone had to act, that waiting was not an option. The British Admiralty had prepared for the worst. Their destroyers, naval trawlers, and larger ships were ready to engage, but the shallow waters meant many could not reach the beaches. Mines floated unseen, enemy planes strafed from above, and the ticking clock of German advancement left no room for hesitation. And yet, as the first of the little ships prepared to leave British shores, there was a strange feeling, a mix of dread and hope. Each captain knew the risk. Each sailor knew they might not return. But the idea of leaving thousands of men to face capture or death was unbearable. History often remembers battles for their strategies, their generals, their victories. But sometimes, history is defined by ordinary people in extraordinary moments. The little ships of Dunkirk were ordinary vessels. A paddle steamer here, a motor yacht there, fishing boats with peeling paint and creaking hulls. Yet, together, they formed a fleet that would defy logic and expectation. They were the embodiment of a simple but powerful truth. Courage does not come from size or firepower, it comes from heart. The journey across the channel was terrifying. German planes roared overhead, their engines like thunder, dropping bombs with precision and malice. Mines drifted silently beneath the waves, invisible threats that could tear a boat apart without warning. And yet, despite the danger, the boats pressed on, their captains navigating by instinct, by memory, by sheer determination. Some were crewed by experienced sailors, others were complete amateurs. But every one of them shared the same goal: to reach Dunkirk, to bring back as many soldiers as possible, and to do so against the odds. Back on the beaches, the soldiers waited. They watched the horizon, counting each small boat as it appeared, clinging to hope as the German guns continued their relentless bombardment. It was not just a rescue, it was a lifeline. And as each boat reached the shore, soldiers scrambled aboard, their faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and relief. The scene was chaotic, yet miraculous. The connection between the stranded men and the volunteers on the water was almost electric, a bond forged in desperation and courage. What made Dunkirk unique was not just the danger or the numbers, it was the human element. Civilians crossing the channel, often for the first time in their lives, faced fire and waves alike, driven by the knowledge that the lives of strangers depended on them. Some boats made it to shore repeatedly, ferrying dozens more each time, while others were damaged or sunk, their crews barely escaping. Every crossing was a gamble, every rescue a victory. In the midst of this, stories emerged that would become legendary. Accounts of families rowing small dinghies to pick up soldiers, of fishermen guiding their trawlers through minefields, of yachtsmen using navigation skills learned on quiet lakes to evade enemy planes. These were not the actions of trained military strategists, but of ordinary people rising to the occasion. The sheer scale of the effort, combined with the courage of those involved, made the evacuation almost unbelievable, a miracle unfolding in real time. And as the first waves of men were brought back across the channel, a pattern began to emerge. The more the little ships risked, the more soldiers were saved. Word spread quickly along the beaches, lifting morale, giving men a reason to hold on, to survive another day. It was a small beacon of hope in a situation that had seemed hopeless. Each return journey reinforced the message: we are not alone, help is coming, survival is possible. By the end of the first day, thousands had been rescued, and yet the effort had only just begun. The Germans were relentless, pushing forward with the precision and speed that had already conquered so much of Europe. The skies remained dangerous, the waters perilous, and the beaches crowded with those who had yet to be saved. And still, the little ships pressed on, each departure a gamble, each arrival a triumph. The stage was set for an evacuation unlike any the world had ever seen. A rescue defined not by military might, but by human courage, resilience, and the willingness to face impossible odds. Dunkirk was not just a place, it was a crucible. And in the heart of that crucible, the little ships became symbols of something far greater than themselves. They were proof that, even in the darkest hours, ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary feats. And as the waves lapped against their hulls, as enemy planes screamed overhead, a miracle quietly unfolded, one boat at a time, one soldier at a time, against a backdrop of war and chaos. The story of Dunkirk is often remembered for the number of lives saved, for the strategic retreat of an army that might otherwise have been annihilated. But behind the statistics lies something more human, more profound, a story of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable spirit of people united by a single purpose. It was the beginning of an incredible journey, a tale that would forever be etched in history as one of the most remarkable rescues the world has ever seen. As the little ships pushed off from the English coast, the sea seemed almost to conspire with them. Waves rose and fell, tossing the tiny vessels like toys, yet somehow they held together. Each boat carried a crew that ranged from seasoned sailors to complete amateurs, and each had a single, unshakable mission: reach Dunkirk, rescue as many men as possible, and return before the enemy caught them. Time was relentless, and danger loomed with every passing second. Crossing the channel was a perilous journey. German bombers patrolled the skies, their engines screaming like the cries of the very men they hunted. Stuka dive bombers roared overhead, wheels spinning, dropping their payloads with terrifying precision. The explosions shook the water, sending plumes of spray high into the air. Some of the boats were hit, some barely escaped, but most pressed on, stubbornly, courageously, as if propelled by sheer will. On the beaches, the scene was desperate. Soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and wounded, many of them drenched and shivering. They had watched as comrades fell to enemy fire, some taken prisoner, others killed outright. And yet, the arrival of even a single small boat sparked a ripple of hope. Men scrambled over sandbags, around burning debris, toward the water. Each landing was chaotic, but every time a boat returned to England with soldiers, it was a victory against despair. The little ships were not uniform. There were yachts with polished decks, pleasure craft with cabins full of curious comforts, fishing trawlers with nets still hanging, and paddle steamers that groaned under the strain of too many passengers. Some were barely seaworthy, others were too small to carry more than a handful of men. Yet, as they reached the beaches, each vessel became a lifeline. Officers and soldiers alike would climb aboard, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time, sometimes dozens, and the captains would push off into the open water, navigating back to England with all the skill, courage, and luck they could muster. Stories from the evacuation read like pages from a legend. One fisherman, a man who had spent his life in calm coastal waters, steered his trawler straight through a minefield, guided only by instinct and the flickering shapes of distant ships. He made it to Dunkirk and returned with dozens of men aboard, a grin of disbelief on his face. Another account tells of a young woman piloting a motor launch, a vessel barely big enough to hold 10, making multiple trips under enemy fire. Each crossing was a new test of courage, skill, and endurance. The scale of the operation is hard to grasp. Over 800 civilian vessels eventually took part, ferrying soldiers from the beaches to larger ships waiting offshore. It was not a carefully orchestrated military maneuver. It was an impromptu armada of hope, assembled in hours, operating in chaos, and achieving the impossible. Naval officers marveled at the effectiveness of the civilian fleet. Ordinary people, doing what they could, saved tens of thousands of lives in just days. Even in the midst of heroism, tragedy was never far away. German planes strafed the beaches and the boats, torpedo boats prowled the waters, and some vessels were sunk almost immediately after leaving England. Lives were lost, and yet the operation never faltered. For every setback, there was an act of courage, a story of survival, a soldier pulled from the brink. Each man or woman who sailed across the channel knew that failure could mean death not just for themselves, but for the soldiers counting on them. The tension was constant, the fear unrelenting, yet the human spirit prevailed. The soldiers who boarded these small boats were a mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, disbelief, often all at once. Men clung to railings, sometimes helping the crew navigate, sometimes too weak to even stand. The boats creaked under the weight of so many bodies. Water splashed over the sides, and yet somehow they floated, and somehow they returned. Conversations on these vessels were brief. Words were unnecessary. Each knew the mission and the stakes. Eyes met, hands gripped, and silently, each crossing became a pact of survival. Interestingly, not all the rescue efforts were straightforward. Some ships could not dock directly on the beaches and had to rely on small rowboats to ferry soldiers out. Others had to navigate minefields, floating debris, or the wreckage of vessels already destroyed. Some captains improvised, constantly finding safer routes, timing departures to avoid air attacks, or coordinating with other boats to share the load. The ingenuity, adaptability, and quick thinking on display were astonishing. Each decision made under duress, every maneuver to avoid destruction, was a testament to human resilience. Amid the danger, remarkable friendships and bonds formed. Soldiers and civilians, strangers brought together by necessity, shared quiet moments in the chaos of war. A young soldier might help haul a wounded comrade aboard a trawler, while a civilian captain guided the vessel with calm precision. Stories abound of soldiers offering the little food they had to their rescuers, or sailors reassuring terrified men that they would make it home. In those small, fleeting moments, humanity shone brighter than the darkness surrounding them. And then there was the element of chance, the random, chaotic element of war that could destroy or save in equal measure. A single bomb might miss a boat by mere inches, or a ship might run aground and still manage to float free. Some vessels were lucky, some unlucky, yet collectively they created a pattern that seemed almost miraculous. By the end of the evacuation, more than 300,000 soldiers had been rescued, an astonishing number given the circumstances. This was no ordinary feat. It was a convergence of courage, skill, determination, and, yes, luck. The little ships also had an unexpected psychological impact. For the soldiers stranded on the beaches, seeing these small boats approach was more than a practical rescue. It was a symbol that they were not abandoned. It was a reassurance that someone, somewhere, cared enough to risk everything to save them. That hope, fragile yet vital, carried men through some of the darkest hours of the war. Without it, the evacuation might have descended into chaos, with morale collapsing under the weight of fear. There were also tactical advantages. The use of civilian vessels relieved pressure on the Royal Navy, allowing larger warships to focus on defending against German attacks and escorting bigger transport ships. The little ships could reach places the destroyers could not, threading shallow waters and navigating around obstacles. Their size and agility became an asset, turning what might have been a logistical nightmare into a workable operation. The combination of civilian courage and military strategy created a synergy that saved lives on an unprecedented scale. The bravery of the crews cannot be overstated. Many were underage, some elderly, others completely inexperienced. They faced one of the most formidable armies in history, hostile skies, and the merciless sea, and yet they continued crossing again and again. Fatigue, fear, and danger did not diminish their determination. Each voyage was a battle against the elements, the enemy, and sometimes their own doubts. And when the boats returned to England, often battered and barely seaworthy, the crews did not retreat, they prepared to go out again. By the third day, the evacuation had taken on a rhythm, a pulse. The little ships became icons of hope, their silhouettes on the horizon signalling salvation. Soldiers clung to them, sailors risked everything to guide them, and the world watched, amazed at the audacity of the operation. It was a ballet of courage and chance, of desperation and ingenuity, unfolding across the grey, storm-tossed waters of the English Channel. The stories from Dunkirk are countless. One man describes rowing a small dinghy alongside a sunken destroyer, helping soldiers swim to safety. Another recounts a yacht taking on nearly 100 men, far beyond its intended capacity, with every inch of deck packed. Paddle steamers that had carried families on Sunday trips now ferried soldiers from certain death to safety. Each story is a testament to ordinary people performing extraordinary acts under unimaginable pressure. And yet, even as the evacuation proceeded, there was never a sense of certainty. The German forces were relentless, and the threat of total disaster loomed constantly. But every crossing, every life saved, chipped away at that despair. The little ships became more than vessels. They became symbols, beacons of courage, determination, and the extraordinary power of human will. As the evacuation entered its final days, the tension on the beaches and the Channel reached a breaking point. The Germans pressed relentlessly, artillery pounding, dive bombers screaming overhead. Every minute mattered. Every boat that reached Dunkirk's shore faced a race against time, a gamble between life and death. And yet, despite the chaos, the little ships continued to arrive, again and again, tiny vessels braving impossible odds for the sake of others. Some crossings were flawless, others were harrowing. Men recounted moments where bombs landed so close that the shock waves lifted boats out of the water. Waves higher than rooftops tossed vessels like corks. Engines failed. Steering broke. Some boats capsized and sank, leaving crews clinging to debris as the water whipped around them. Yet for every disaster, there were triumphs. A fisherman's trawler might limp back to England, waterlogged and battered, carrying dozens of men who would otherwise have been captured or killed. The courage on display was breathtaking. The human drama was raw and immediate. Soldiers saved aboard these tiny craft often collapsed with exhaustion, shivering in wet clothes, too drained to speak. The civilians manning the vessels faced similar trials. Their hands blistered, their faces streaked with sweat and salt, eyes fixed on the horizon, hearts pounding. And yet, in those moments of exhaustion, there was also a quiet pride. They were part of something larger than themselves, part of a story that would be remembered for generations. One of the most remarkable aspects of Dunkirk was the repeated voyages. Many of the little ships made multiple trips. A single small boat could ferry men across the Channel, return under fire, and do it again, sometimes 3 or 4 times in a single day. The logistics were staggering, yet somehow it worked. Soldiers began to recognize familiar boats, waving or cheering as they climbed aboard. Crews developed informal routines, learning the safest ways to approach the beaches, to load men quickly, to evade bombs and strafing runs. Amid the fear, acts of humanity shone. Soldiers shared rations with exhausted crews. Civilians offered comforting words, steadying hands, encouragement to keep going. In the middle of a war that often stripped life down to its rawest brutality, moments of compassion persisted. These little gestures, so easily overlooked in the scale of a global conflict, became the invisible threads holding the evacuation together. They were proof that courage is not just about facing danger, but about caring for one another in the face of it. Then there were the miracles, the small, improbable escapes that seemed almost divine. A motor launch, overloaded with men, might drift through an air raid without a scratch. A sailing yacht might avoid a mine by mere inches. Entire waves of soldiers would be rescued by boats that, by all reason, should have been destroyed. These moments defied logic, yet they became the heartbeat of Dunkirk. It was as if the sea itself had chosen to aid these courageous civilians, carrying them to safety despite the fury of war. And as the final days approached, the urgency intensified. The beachheads were shrinking. German forces were closing in. The Royal Navy coordinated the last efforts, but it was the little ships that carried the heaviest burden. Smaller, faster, and more maneuverable, they threaded the narrow spaces between mines, wreckage, and artillery fire. The men on board understood that their actions might determine the survival of thousands. Every crossing became a story of high stakes and heart-pounding tension. Some boats never made it back. Some crews were lost, taken by bombs, mines, or the icy waters. Yet their sacrifice was never in vain. Each life lost reminded those who remained why they had come, why they continued, and why the evacuation, against all odds, was succeeding. And for every casualty, there were dozens, hundreds, of soldiers saved, walking away from Dunkirk to fight another day, to carry the hope of survival back into the world. The emotional weight of the evacuation cannot be overstated. Men who had faced death on the beaches clung to the little ships as symbols of life itself. Civilians who had never sailed beyond calm waters found themselves in the most dangerous theatre imaginable, and through it all, courage and humanity prevailed. When the final numbers were tallied, over 338,000 soldiers had been rescued. It was a number that seemed impossible, almost mythic, given the chaos, the danger, and the odds stacked against them. When the last soldiers left Dunkirk, the beaches were nearly empty, the sand marked only by the remnants of destruction, burning vehicles, scattered equipment, the ghosts of those who did not make it. The little ships, battered but triumphant, returned to England, carrying stories, scars, and memories that would last a lifetime. They were ordinary vessels that had achieved the extraordinary, driven not by firepower or strategy, but by courage, compassion, and the determination to act when it mattered most. The impact of Dunkirk was felt far beyond the immediate rescue. It became a symbol, a story of hope and resilience that inspired a nation under threat. Winston Churchill himself described it as a miracle of deliverance, acknowledging that it was the bravery of ordinary people, the fishermen, the yacht owners, the civilians that had saved so many lives. The operation showed that even in the darkest hours, collective courage could make a decisive difference. It demonstrated that heroism is not always about victory in battle, but about saving lives against staggering odds. Dunkirk also left a lasting legacy in the hearts and minds of those who experienced it. Soldiers carried the memory of the tiny vessels that had saved them, of the civilians who had risked everything for strangers. Civilians remembered the fear and the exhilaration of each crossing, the roar of engines, the screams of planes, and the laughter and tears that accompanied each successful rescue. It became a story passed down through families, told and retold as a testament to human resilience and solidarity. And so, when we look back at the little ships of Dunkirk, we are reminded that history is not only shaped by generals and battleships, but by ordinary people willing to act in extraordinary circumstances. It is a story that transcends military strategy, a story of courage, hope, and the power of human determination. The tiny vessels, creaking and bobbing against the tide, became the lifeline of an army, the embodiment of selflessness, and the miracle that turned near certain disaster into salvation. Dunkirk teaches us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. That bravery is often quiet, persistent, and deeply human. That in the darkest moments, when fear threatens to paralyze, courage can emerge from the most unexpected places. An elderly fisherman, a young yachtsman, a mother guiding a motorboat, and that miracles, sometimes, are simply the result of ordinary people refusing to give up, refusing to leave others behind, and choosing action over despair. The sea calmed after the evacuation, but the memory of those days remained. The beaches of Dunkirk, once filled with fear and chaos, were forever etched in history as the site of an extraordinary human achievement. And the little ships, small and unassuming, became immortal, not just as vessels, but as symbols of hope, courage, and the enduring spirit of humanity. The story of Dunkirk is a reminder that heroism does not always wear a uniform. It can appear in the most ordinary of people, in the smallest of boats, and in the quiet determination to do what is right, no matter the risk. And as we remember the miracle at sea, we honor the men and women who showed the world that even in the darkest hour, courage and compassion can light the way.